Welcome to our Digging Deeper series as we look at Daniel chapter 6. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about Daniel 6, but at the same time, we're going to kind of wrap up the third point that we want to equip you with as we talk about how to study the Bible well. We've talked about observation and three kind of guideposts on that in chapters 1, 2, and 3. And then in 4, 5, and now 6, we're dealing with the topic of biblical interpretation, and this is a huge topic. So please recognize we're just going to get a couple of handholds here to help guide you. There's a lot of literature and some other places you can go even further still down the topic. Check it out in the description. Now, in our last point on Daniel chapter 6, we're going to talk about interpreting by also looking at the cultural context. And I'm going to illustrate this as we look through the text, but just as a reminder, hopefully you've seen the video, the message on this already, but part of how I glossed Daniel chapter 6 was it's not about how Daniel survived the lion's den. It's actually how did Daniel survive living in the court, living in the eye of some really jealous and backstabbing politicians. Because in Daniel chapter 6, in the lion's den, it's a story of jealous kind of co-workers who are going to soon be, if not already, underneath Daniel's authority, and they don't want to see that happen at all. So they concoct a sort of plan that uses the king kind of as a dupe in this instance, trapping him in his own words and forcing this situation on Daniel. Now, a lot of things happen in this chapter, but I want to focus on this idea of cultural context as part of our interpretive lens that we all have and we want to be aware of as much as possible, but also leveraging that in a good way as we come to the text. So let me give a couple of points for how just understanding the cultural backdrop and some things that the text tells us about, some things that we had to do a little bit of study on ourselves to figure out, but how that gives a depth to the text. Now it gives a depth, it gives some color to it. It also gives some clarity as we are looking at how do we interpret this text. Let's look at a few examples. So when we first get introduced to Daniel chapter 6, we get this kind of interesting dialogue with how it is administratively set up with 120 satraps and so on and so forth. And at first that may seem a little benign. Why do we need to know the organizational structure of politics? We haven't really dealt with that a lot previously. We get some hints of it, but this is giving a bit more clarity, and part of it is driving to help us understand the cultural context with how it worked within the court. And so this was how such a large empire was being managed. And as we read further and further, we come to find out that it was Daniel actually who was going to be set above even the others. And so you get the sense of here's this new administration, right? For thinking of our historical context. Darius had wrested the kingdom along with Cyrus, or however those two split apart, and from Belshazzar. And now he's setting up a new administration. And some of those individuals are being carried forward, like Daniel. But in the structure of how things are being set up, Daniel is collecting more and more influence, more and more favor, more and more power. And when we understand that context, that here's some people, these satraps, or kind of upper middle management, we'll say, have been working and clawing their way. There's probably been a lot of upheaval in the transition between the Babylonians and the Medes and the Persians. And so these are people who have survived by either just being really, really good at what they do, and so they're indispensable in this new context, or they're just really, really good at staying alive and kind of staying in power. So when we look at this cultural context and really try to get into the perspective that the text is giving about these other satraps, it really gives us an impression of the jealousy that they're coming with when they come here. And the reason why that's important for us to understand from just an interpretive standpoint, one, what's their motive in this? It's really interesting to watch the motives that happen in this. So their motive really is not for what is best for the empire. Actually, it's detrimental to that. They're willing to sacrifice the king who's over them, and that's a risky gambit. They're also willing to sacrifice someone who's doing an excellent job to help push the organization, so to speak, forward. So when we look at even just some of the cultural context that the chapter itself gives us, it gives us a little bit of color, some clarity, some insight into how these people are thinking when they come. It's not just, hey, we made a suggestion, oh wow, look, that caught up Daniel. When we step back, it helps us kind of step in their sandals, so to speak, and it will give us a bit of a different perspective as we interpret the text. The second person that we look at in this cultural context is the king himself, who they come forward to Darius, and they put forward this plan that no one should make supplication or ask for request to any other god but you. Now, the reason why some cultural backdrop here is important for us, because again, it gives us insight into Darius and what he might be thinking at this point. So when we know about the Medes and the Persians, which was true of Babylon, right, they did have some preferred tracts of deities, but it was certainly a polytheistic culture. And in fact, it was kind of a conglomerate. So they had their preferred deities that they worshipped, but they also had a level of tolerance for just the worship of other gods, even if you just kind of keep it to yourself. Hence why Daniel had been allowed to do what he had been doing, as the text tells us, which was praising the God of the Bible. And so we have this polytheistic outlook in culture. And when you understand that, it actually highlights how bizarre of a request or a suggestion this was from the satraps, right? That we want you to make a decree that no one else can pray to anyone but you. And sometimes if we don't understand the polytheistic backdrop in that, we might not think much of it. But when you put it in that cultural context, what it really implies, that the insight or the color that it gives to what Darius is thinking or doing in this chapter, is that it's really pretty selfish, right? It's appealing to his pride. It's not a normal statement that no one can worship anyone but Darius. That's not how they set the system up. That's not how the culture worked. But they were appealing to his pride to say, hey, just for a month, okay, people pray to all these other gods, but I think it's important that they remember that you're really the one at the end of the day who puts bread on the plate. And so it's an interesting discussion that they bring forward, but the very fact that he's willing to do that sort of a decree when that wasn't their typical cultural stance shows just how pride was kind of operating in his heart, which brings us back to this point. Who's really loyal here? Who is really the one who is for the nation, for the empire? The satraps are suggesting that it's them. Clearly, they're operating out of a selfishness and jealousy. Darius, who's supposed to be in charge of this thing, is operating out of a place of pride and not even aware of the domino effect that this is going to have on some other people that he at the end of the day doesn't want to see them hurt, but he's kind of duped into this. And the context gives us culturally that, you know, even the king himself wasn't allowed to change something once it was made a law. And so that's what creates our scenario of tension within the chapter. Last thing I want to point out from a cultural backdrop standpoint, and this is one that's not as obvious in the text and does require us to do some background study. There's some great scholarship on the book of Daniel from various perspectives, but one of the things that I noted in the message that's kind of a cultural backdrop was the fact that Daniel's setup with his home was really unusual. And unless you just happen to be, you know, astute with Babylonian and Medo-Persian architecture, this is something that doing some background study and research is going to help us with. So to know that, you know, most people did not have these permanent structures on the very top of their house that was specifically meant for prayer, that was facing a very particular direction. Even Daniel's posture of prayer was not something that was how it was commonly expressed at that time. All of that cultural backdrop helps us interpret a bit what Daniel's doing here. It's not that we wouldn't have understood that Daniel's taking a stand in this moment. We could understand that without knowing much more of the cultural backdrop, but it does give us more insight into how Daniel is thinking, how Daniel has been operating. The fact that Daniel has continually done this in a way that is both apparent and makes statements, that should tell us something about how we should be operating our lives. And so it helps give us some depth and color. And you'll hear me use those words a lot, depth and color. And the reason I say that is this: whether it's interpreting things about the satraps and how legal structures were organized, administrative structures were done, whether it's about the king and how worship was typically done within that area, what does that imply about his actions, or Daniel with his prayer house, all these things help enhance our understanding of the story. They give clarity, some color to it, but what they don't do is they don't dramatically change the story in such a way that it seems really in far opposition from what the face value of the text will say, what I'll call the plain interpretation of the text. And I mention that for this point. Sometimes people talk about they really love deep messages, right? We love deep messages. Sometimes what we define, or I'm afraid sometimes what we mean by deep, is novel. Something I haven't heard. It's deep if I learn something new, and there's a great benefit to learning something new. But a deep message is actually one where it's faithfully preached, where the Spirit of God empowers it as it resonates within us, and as the believer is consistently walking in the Spirit and applying it. That's actually what a deep message is. Sometimes we have this danger, particularly on this issue of cultural backdrop, that we really need to be aware of, where someone digs really deep into some sort of cultural backdrop or situation, and when they come back out of that and they apply it to the text, it's a dramatic reinterpretation of the text that seems to go against what common sense reading and what a history of scholarship, a history of church leaders and men and women interpreting the text, it comes out very different. That should be a sign that we need to be really cautious. Now, could there be some sort of cultural insight that really helps us see the text in a very different light? Certainly. But when it's dramatic, we really need to stop and say, we need to be careful about using cultural backdrops to somehow override what is the normative historical interpretation of the text. I'll give you an example of this. I had someone who had a discussion with me. This was years ago. I was in high school, and someone wanted to talk about the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. And they said, well, if you look back at the development of the Hebrew language, vowels really weren't accounted for in the written text at much of the time that this was being written. In fact, those were kind of added much later. And so when we understand culturally, there was these implications for how you would read and understand these sort of things. Then when we come to the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, what we actually have is just two letters, which we would translate as R and D in English. So we don't have the vowels, and the readers would understand it. But if you look at the culture, what the readers would have understood was that was the reed sea, as in a very shallow, marshy body of water that's got reeds sticking out of it. And so the person interpreted the text like this and said, we don't really need to believe that this giant wall of water parted and that they walked across on dry ground. That's a little ridiculous. When we look at the cultural context, this backdrop and linguistic and cultural backdrop, it really teaches us that, they had just found kind of a shallow part in the river, and, God maybe led them to that part, and they crossed through this marsh that, maybe the water was this high. Okay, that's the sort of thing where when someone starts giving an interpretation and appealing to some sort of historical context or cultural context or linguistic context that does a dramatic override of the text, that's where it should start to give some red flags to, is that a lot of these help improve our interpretation. If it's a dramatic retelling, doesn't mean it's automatically not true, but it does mean we need to be very intentional and scrupulous about how we interpret that before we just kind of take that in. By the way, I said to that person, that's pretty amazing that if they walked across on a reed sea, only about a half a foot deep or something, what's really the miracle in that is somehow how an entire Egyptian army that were in chariots and with horses drowned in about 6 inches of water. That would be a pretty amazing miracle. So whenever we get to something that's very different and doesn't seem to make sense, let's stop and check. I encourage you this week, as you're looking through Daniel chapter 6 and as the chapters go forward, or in some of our other biblical passages, take some time to consider the cultural context. Maybe grab some resources on it to help give depth and clarity and color to the text and come at it in a fresh way. Thanks for tuning in this week, and look forward to seeing you next week as we look at some bizarre imagery from Daniel chapter 7.